For better or worse, this was supposed to be our final message in the series One Glorious Hope, the study of the New Testament book of Colossians. But because of the rains and rising waters on Sunday, we will move that message to this coming Sunday, where Paul gives his now what instructions to the church. You won't want to miss that. Either tune in or be there with us on Sunday. But tonight, we'll look at the final 10 to 12 verses of this fourth chapter of the book of Colossians, and we'll see what we think of as Paul's customary Christian greetings and personal notes about co-workers to the church at Colossae. But what I hope we see tonight is that these greetings and comments are not mere formalities, nor are they simply to fill up some space. No, in fact, each of these people that Paul mentions is a very important part of the work of sharing the gospel message. And each of them represents a fantastic story from which you and I can learn some valuable insight, especially one of them. We'll get to him a little bit later. Let's take a quick look at the list. Chapter 4 of Colossians, beginning with verse 7. Find a guy with an interesting name, Tychicus. Tychicus, who is a beloved brother, a faithful minister, and a fellow servant in the Lord, will tell you all the news about me. I am sending him to you for this very purpose, that he may know your circumstances and comfort your hearts. With Onesimus, a faithful and beloved brother who is one of you, they will make known to you all things which are happening here. So our first two are Tychicus and Onesimus. Now, Tychicus, we'll have to check with Pastor Tim and see how good a job or bad a job I'm doing pronouncing that name. But he is entrusted with the delivery of this important letter to the Colossian church, along with Onesimus. Tychicus is from that area. We know that from Acts chapter 20. So he would have been known, and as Paul indicates here, he was loved by the believers in Colossae. He also, by the way, delivered Paul's letter to the Ephesian church, the church at Ephesus. Boy, how would you like to have that on your resume? I just delivered Paul's letters to the Ephesians and the Colossian Christians. No big deal. Now, Onesimus, also from Colossae, he was a slave. You might remember him from the book of Philemon. He was a slave who had apparently run away from Philemon, his owner. Philemon, oddly enough, might have actually hosted the Colossian church in his home. Well, okay, so we have Paul making this mention of Onesimus, and it seems that we find from the book of Philemon that Paul had encountered Onesimus in prison. He had led him to the Lord, and Onesimus, this runaway slave, became a believer. And as we read in the book of Philemon, Paul is now sending him back to Philemon. He's sending him back to reconcile the two of them, but now reconciled as Christian brothers. What a great story. Notice, too, that Tychicus and Onesimus will be reporting. Both, they will be telling the church, the Colossian church, all the things that are going on in Paul's life with his time in prison, with the ministry, with things that are continuing at the other churches. And meanwhile, Paul instructs them to tell Tychicus and Onesimus what's going on, and that they would bring a report back to Paul of how things are going in the Colossian church. This was really important, especially in these days before Facebook. You couldn't just go online and check in and see how people were doing. So you had to send messengers back and forth. As we continue to verses 10 and 11, we come upon the name Aristarchus. Paul writes, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you with Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, about whom you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. And Jesus, who is called Justus. These are my only fellow workers for the kingdom of God, who are of the circumcision. They have proved to be a comfort to me. So he mentions these three that were of the circumcision, in other words, of Jewish faith. And we start with Aristarchus. He was from Thessalonica. We also know this from the book of Acts. Aristarchus was from Thessalonica. He had been a fellow missionary with Paul on Paul's missionary journeys. In Acts 19, they're in Ephesus. And you may remember this story how the power of God just fell and people are getting saved. Demons are being cast out in a very horribly pagan city that was Ephesus at that time. You might remember the account of Demetrius, the silversmith. A lot of the silversmiths, they made their living by creating these little images, silver images of Diana, the goddess Diana. And they sold them as though they were deity. But now all these people were becoming believers in Jesus. And as they became believers in Jesus, they were no longer interested in little pieces of silver. And so Demetrius, obviously his way of living is being threatened. He rouses up a crowd. They end up taking them into the theater with a mob just ready to harass the whole gang. Well, two of the companions of Paul that Acts 19 talks about being taken into the theater to be harassed, of those companions, one of them was Aristarchus. And so we see him being mentioned again here to the Colossian church because he continues to be faithful as he works and ministers with Paul. Down to verse 12 and 13, we come to Epaphras. Epaphras, who is one of you, a servant of Christ, greets you, always laboring fervently for you in prayers, that you may stand perfect and complete in all the will of God. For I bear him witness that he has a great zeal for you, and for those who are in Laodicea, and those who are in Hierapolis. Laodicea was about 10 miles away from Colossia, so kind of sister congregations in that same area. Well, we see the name Epaphras. Epaphras, we talked about him way back early on in this series. We talked about him at the beginning of the study. He had been saved under Paul's ministry. He probably started the Colossian church. We also see, if we had continued to verse 14, a brief mention of Luke, the beloved physician, greets you. So Luke, who gave us the Gospel of Luke, also continues to work with Paul and be in conversation with Paul, and so he sends his greeting to the Colossian Christians. Well, I want to come back to verse 10, because I don't know if you noticed it, but I kind of went past somebody that I read about in verse 10, where we talked about Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you with Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. Mark. 12 years prior to the writing of this book, Mark was with Paul on Paul's first missionary journey. But he left early, and he went home. We're not sure exactly what happened. He may have gotten homesick, but nonetheless, he didn't stick it out for the entire journey. He left and went back home. As a result, Paul and Barnabas had quite a falling out over Mark. And Paul, when it came time for his second missionary journey, refused to take Mark on that journey with him. There was some serious stuff in the early church. But what a great story. What we see here in Paul mentioning Mark and telling the people, if you see him, welcome him. What we see is that Mark has been restored. He's back working with Paul. He is welcomed. He is commended by Paul for his faithful work in sharing the gospel message. Oh, by the way, Mark wrote a pretty cool book, the second book of the New Testament. What a great story. And wow, how I wish we had more of these stories, even these days. A great story of restoration in the church. What's next for the church? Check in Sunday and you'll find out.